Unit 4, linear and absolute value functions, question number 3. So question number 3 wants us to identify the visual for domain and range. So first things we need to know, firstly the question says determine the domain of the following graph. So domain are your x values, so you need to look from left to right. Range are your y values, you look from bottom to the top. So for this question, because it says domain, we're going to look at our function from the furthest left to the furthest right. So it started right here, so it started at this point when x was negative 11, and then it followed this line, followed this curve, and then it stopped at this point when the x was positive 6. Okay, so essentially these are the starting points where it starts, and this is where it ends. Okay, so to represent this, there's multiple ways you could represent this. Okay, you can represent it with brackets and parentheses. So because right here we see a closed circle, okay, if you remember, a closed dot or a closed circle, okay, is going to be, or whenever you see something shaded like that, that means it's closed. That means it's going to be represented with a bracket. Okay, an open circle looks like an open with it's not shaded. That means it's a parentheses. Okay, so at negative 11 you technically have a bracket, and then as it goes along, when it got to 6 there's an open circle, so it would be a parentheses, and that would be the domain. Okay, so when you represent this domain as you see right here, this is called interval notation. So here's now the other way you could represent the domain. So both answers are going to be correct, but here's another way you could represent it. Okay, you could represent it as something called inequality notation. Okay, so when you're doing inequality, it started at negative 11, so negative 11 will be the lowest point that it is, and then it moved this direction. So because negative 11 has a solid dot means that it's closed. A close means that there's a line underneath. But because you're moving to this direction, negative 11 will be the smallest amount, and then we have our less than or equal to sign, a line underneath because it's closed. We're talking about x, and then it went from there to 6, and it would be a less than sign because of the fact that 6 is open. So this is the other way you could represent that domain. Okay, so either way works. Alright, so let's try to do the range. So the range are your y values. You need to go from bottom to the top. So the lowest point right here, so I'm going to use dotted lines to represent it. The lowest point is when y is negative 6, and then the highest point would be when y is negative 1. Okay, so that means we started at negative 6. At negative 6 there's a solid dot, so that means we would have a bracket, a square bracket, because it is closed. And then it got to negative 1, which also has a solid dot, so that means it's also closed, so it's going to be also a square bracket. Okay, and that would be the range. Okay, so that's interval notation. Let's try to do inequality notation for the range. So when you're doing inequality notation, we started at negative 6. We see that it moves upwards, so that means negative 6 is going to be the smallest amount. So we're going to say it's less than, because it's closed, it's going to have or equal to. Range are your y values, okay? And then it goes up to negative 1, so it's still less than. There's a closed dot, so or equal to negative 1. And these are the two ways you could represent your answer.